In the autumn of 1783, in a room in Paris, Great Britain signed away the most valuable thing it owned. Not a fortress, not a fleet, a nation. The 13 American colonies, the oldest, the most populous, the most developed possessions Britain had built anywhere on Earth, were gone. Nearly 2.5 million people, a coastline of thriving ports, a century and a half of settlement, recognized in a single stroke of the pen as free, sovereign, and no longer British. By every measure a contemporary would have used, this was a catastrophe. The crown jewel of the empire had been lost, and the men who signed believed they were watching the end of something. They were watching the beginning, because here is the fact that should not make sense. In the decades after Britain lost America, its empire did not shrink. It grew, and it kept growing, until it became the largest empire in the history of the world, ruling a quarter of the planet's land, and very nearly a quarter of all the people alive. The defeat that was supposed to be the ending turned out to be the hinge. So how does a nation lose its richest possession and emerge stronger than any power that has ever existed? That is the question this story will answer, slowly and carefully, following the evidence wherever it leads. So whether you have come for the history, to test an argument that runs against everything the textbooks taught you, or simply to let the story carry you off into the quiet of the night, settle in. To understand why losing the colonies could possibly help Britain, you have to understand what those colonies actually were. Not simply land, not a distant outpost of traders and soldiers. They were a society. 13 self-governing communities strung along the eastern seaboard of North America, home to roughly 2.5 million people by the time the trouble began. Towns, churches, courthouses, printing presses, harbours thick with masts. This was the most populous, most settled, most developed thing Britain had built anywhere overseas, and that fact, that very success, contained the flaw that would tear it loose. A settler colony is a different creature from a trading post. When a company plants a fort to buy spices, it sends clerks who mean to grow rich and sail home. But when families cross an ocean to stay, to clear ground, raise children, bury their dead in new soil, they do not think of themselves as visitors. They think of themselves as transplanted Englishmen, carrying with them everything an Englishman believed he was owed. And by the 1760s, the overwhelming majority of the colonists, something like 85 in every 100 of the white population, traced their ancestry to the British Isles. They were not strangers to English liberty, they were its children. That inheritance had been carried across the water from the very beginning. When the first lasting English colony took root at Jamestown in 1607, it survived its starving years, and, within little more than a decade, did something quietly revolutionary. It convened an assembly of elected representatives to make laws for itself. A handful of settlers on a malarial riverbank, sitting down to govern in the manner of the parliament they had left behind. The habit of self-rule was not a later invention of angry revolutionaries. It was present at the founding, planted with the first crops. It travelled north as well. When the Mayflower passengers came ashore far from the territory their charter named, they paused, before stepping onto land, to draw up a compact, an agreement among themselves to make and obey their own laws for the common good. It was a small document and a practical one, but the instinct beneath it would echo for a century and a half, that legitimate authority rests on the consent of the governed, and that men who have agreed to be ruled may also judge how they are ruled. The colonists did not learn this in 1776. They brought it with them in 1620. New England hardened the instinct into something close to a creed. The Puritans who flooded into Massachusetts came precisely to escape an authority they would not accept, a church and a crown that presumed to dictate their conscience. They built a society around the conviction that no distant bishop and no distant king could command the inner life of a free people. They governed their towns in meetings, argued their faith in their own pulpits, and answered, in their own minds, to God rather than to London. A people raised to refuse one authority do not easily bow to another. So consider what Britain actually possessed in these colonies. not docile subjects, but free Englishmen abroad, men who believed, sincerely and to their bones, that they held the full rights of Englishmen at home. Chief among those rights was an ancient one, that a free man could not be taxed except by his own consent, given through his own representatives. In England, that consent came through Parliament. In the colonies, it came through the assemblies the colonists elected. To them, the logic was seamless. They paid the taxes their assemblies laid. They owed nothing to a parliament in which no colonist sat. Each colony had its own legislature, and to the colonists these bodies were not local councils but their own parliaments, the proper and only authority that could reach into their pockets. London saw it differently, and the gap between those two views was the fault line along which everything would eventually break. When Britain offered the doctrine of virtual representation, the claim that Parliament somehow stood for every British subject everywhere, voting or not, the colonists found it absurd. "A knot too weak," one of them wrote, "to hold anything at all." They knew what representation felt like. This was not it. And here lies the first hard truth about the crown jewel. It was extraordinarily expensive to keep. A scattered society of 2.5 million, spread across a vast frontier, pressed against hostile borders, was not a treasure chest that simply paid out. It was a standing commitment, soldiers to garrison, frontiers to police, governors to fund. The colonies generated real wealth through trade, but they also consumed protection on a scale that grew heavier with every passing decade. The asset and the liability were the same object. You could not have the one without the other. Then came the war that changed the arithmetic forever. The 7 Years' War, what the colonists called the French and Indian War, ended in 1763 with a sweeping British victory that drove France from the North American continent. But triumph came at a staggering price. Britain emerged from the conflict carrying a national debt of roughly £130 million, a sum so vast it strained the imagination of the age. The empire had won the continent. Now it had to find a way to pay for having won it. To London, the answer seemed obvious, even just. British soldiers had bled to secure the colonies and would have to remain to defend them. Surely the colonists, the chief beneficiaries, should help carry the cost. It was a reasonable thought in a Westminster drawing room. It was an outrage on a Boston street. The colonists believed they had already paid in blood and treasure during the war, and they had never much feared the French invasion the new garrisons supposedly guarded against. To them, this was not shared burden. It was a tax dressed as protection. So in 1765, Parliament reached directly into the colonies for the first time, with the Stamp Act, a levy requiring an official stamp, bought with hard British currency, on newspapers, legal documents, pamphlets, playing cards, the ordinary paper of daily life. It was modest in design and catastrophic in effect. For the first time, a tax had been laid on the colonists, not by their own assemblies, but by a parliament across the ocean. The colonists did not merely dislike it. They declared it a violation of the deepest right they possessed, and they refused. The cry that rose was not really about the cost of a stamp. It was a slogan that compressed a whole constitutional argument into 4 words: no taxation without representation. The grievance was structural, not financial. The colonists would have paid. What they would not accept was being taxed by a body in which they had no voice. For that was the very definition, to an Englishman's mind, of being reduced from a free man to a slave. Delegates from 9 colonies gathered in New York to say so together, the first time the scattered colonies had acted as one. The habit of joint resistance had been born. Faced with riots, boycotts, and merchants at home howling about lost trade, Parliament backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. But it could not bring itself to concede the principle. On the very same day it repealed the tax, it passed the Declaratory Act, which asserted that Parliament held full authority to make laws binding the colonies in all cases whatsoever. It was a fateful sentence. Britain had retreated on the tax, while insisting, in writing, on the power behind it. The quarrel was not settled. It had merely been named, and the naming made it permanent. From there, the road ran one direction only. New taxes followed, New protests answered them, and each cycle deepened the distrust until trust was gone. The flashpoint became a cargo of tea in Boston Harbor, thrown into the water by men who would rather destroy a fortune than pay a penny of duty to a parliament they did not recognize. London responded with punishment, the colonies responded with defiance, and a constitutional disagreement curdled into armed rebellion. By 1775, the talking was over. The richest possession Britain owned was at war with the nation that owned it. Step back from the muskets and the slogans and the deeper pattern comes into view. The 13 colonies were not ungovernable by accident, nor because Britain blundered, though Britain blundered often. They were ungovernable because of what they were, a colony of free Englishmen who believed, to their marrow, that they held rights no distant government could touch. You cannot settle a frontier with people raised on liberty and expect them to remain forever silent and obedient. The very qualities that made the colonies thrive were the qualities that made them resist. And a people convinced they hold rights will, sooner or later, demand the fullest right of all, the right to govern themselves entirely. This is not a flaw of British administration. It is a property of the settler model itself. Plant free men on distant soil, let them prosper, let them rule their own towns for a century and a half, and you have not built a permanent possession. You have built a nation that has not yet noticed it is one. The demand for independence was not an aberration in the story of the 13 colonies. It was the destination written into their founding. So the loss of America was not a random misfortune that happened to befall the empire. It was the failure of a particular kind of colony, the kind built on settlers who carry their liberties with them and will not surrender them. That model had a defect at its very core, and the defect was not fixable by better governors or gentler taxes. It was structural. It was in the design. The empire would not fully grasp this for another half-century, but the lesson was already there, waiting, in the smoke over Boston. Which leaves us holding a strange and uncomfortable fact. This thing that was lost, the most populous, most developed, most prosperous possession in the entire British world, was also the most expensive to keep, the most difficult to rule, and the most certain, in the end, to break free. Hold that thought, because the rest of this story turns on it. We have established what the crown jewel was. Now we must ask the question that should have been impossible. What if losing it was not the empire's tragedy at all, but the beginning of its rise? Yes, the colonies were expensive and unruly, but they were also fabulously profitable. The tobacco, the rice, the timber, the captive market for British manufactures, the whole humming machinery of Atlantic trade. The colonies poured wealth into Britain for a century and a half. By that measure, losing them should not have been a hidden blessing at all. It should have been a financial amputation. So we have to take the objection seriously. Was the wealth real? It was entirely real. The 13 colonies sat at the heart of a transatlantic trading system that had made British ports rich. Southern plantations shipped tobacco and rice. Northern harbours sent fish, timber and ships. And in return the colonists bought British cloth, British tools, British finished goods of every description. By law, much of this commerce had to flow through Britain, where merchants took their cut on the way past. The colonies were a source of raw materials and a guaranteed buyer of manufactures at the same time. On paper, no rational empire would ever let such an arrangement go. So the assumption of the age was straightforward, and it was shared on both sides of the ocean. Cut the political tie, and the commercial wealth would bleed out with it. Lose the colonies, and you lose the trade. The whole logic of empire in the 18th century rested on the belief that commerce followed the flag, that you had to own a territory to profit from it, that prosperity and possession were one and the same thing. By that reasoning, the surrender of 1783 was not merely a blow to British pride, it was the loss of the golden goose itself. And then the goose kept laying. This is the fact that quietly undoes the whole assumption. When Britain legalized trade with its former colonies in the spring of 1783, American consumers, starved of British goods through 8 years of war, fell upon them. British products surged across the Atlantic. The political bond had been severed, the soldiers had sailed home, the flag had come down, and the ships kept sailing, their holds full in both directions. The commerce that was supposed to depend on ownership turned out not to depend on it at all. The road was not perfectly smooth, and it would dishonor the truth to pretend it was. The mid-1780s brought a sharp recession. The young United States, locked out of certain imperial markets and short of hard money, suffered real hardship before it found its feet. But the deeper current ran one way. After the two nations normalized their relations in the 1790s, trade between Britain and its former colony did not merely recover, it expanded, enormously, into a relationship far larger than anything the colonial period had ever produced. The interruption was temporary. The bond was permanent. The numbers settled the matter. By 1790, British goods made up something close to 9 in every 10 of all American imports. Through the first half of the 19th century, between a third and a half of everything the United States bought from abroad came from Britain. Two nations lately at war had become each other's most important trading partners, and they did it with no shared flag, no governor, no garrison, no parliament binding one to the other. The commerce flourished precisely in the absence of the empire that was supposed to be its foundation. Here is the realization that reframes everything that came before. Britain had not lost the value of the colonies. It had lost only the cost of them. The trade, the actual source of the wealth, continued and grew. But the burdens that had come attached to that trade, the armies and the governors, and the endless expense of ruling 2.5 million restless people, those had been handed off entirely to the Americans themselves. Britain kept the customer and discarded the dependent. It was, though no one had planned it, an astonishingly good deal. Set the two ledgers side by side and the asymmetry is stark. To govern the colonies had cost a fortune. Soldiers to garrison the frontier, officials to administer the ports, warships to patrol the coast, and the standing risk of rebellion that finally came due. To trade with the independent United States cost Britain almost nothing. A merchant, a ship, a contract, a handshake. The wealth flowed in either case. But in the second case it flowed without the crushing overhead of empire. The flag, it turned out, had been the expensive part. The commerce had never needed it. And beneath the trade in goods, a deeper bond was forming, one of money itself. The City of London was becoming the financial heart of the world, and American merchants, planters, and even the young American government reached instinctively toward it, for the capital they could not raise at home. British investment flowed into American debt and American enterprise. The two economies grew entangled at the level of credit, not just cargo, a connection more intimate and more durable than any colonial charter. The empire had let America go politically and quietly absorbed it financially. There is a plaque that captures the whole arrangement in a single line. The great American financier of the next century, the founder of a banking dynasty that would shape both nations, was memorialized with a description of his enterprise that read, in effect, Merchant of Boston and London, 2 cities, 1 business, 1 Atlantic. The war had drawn a border across the ocean, and the money simply ignored it. Capital, like trade, recognized no flag. The commercial and financial compact between Britain and America outlived the political rupture and grew stronger in its absence. What Britain had stumbled into, without ever choosing it or even understanding it at the time, was a different and far cheaper kind of empire, an informal one, not territory ruled, but markets dominated, not subjects governed, but customers served. You did not need to own a country to grow rich from it. You needed only to sell to it, lend to it, ship for it, and let someone else carry the costs and the headaches of actually running it. The independent United States became the first great demonstration of this principle, and it was a revelation. The profit of the colonies and the burden of the colonies had always been bundled together, and Britain had assumed, as everyone assumed, that they were inseparable. The loss of America pried them apart. It revealed that the profit could be kept while the burden was shed. And once you have seen that profit and possession are not the same thing, you can never quite see the project of empire the same way again. A flag, after all, is enormously expensive. It must be defended with fleets and garrisons, administered with bureaucracies, justified to the people who live beneath it, and held against everyone who would tear it down. A contract costs none of these things. It is signed, honoured, and renewed, and it asks nothing of the soldier or the tax collector. When Britain traded the flag in America for a contract with America, it did not lose wealth, it lost overhead. The thing it surrendered was the most costly part of the whole enterprise. So the meaning of 1783 begins to shift before our eyes. The first glimpse arrives of the better model, the model that would, in time, carry the empire to a size the world had never seen. Rule lightly where you can, trade everywhere you are able, and never confuse the wealth a place produces with the cost of holding it down. The colonies had taught Britain, through the pain of their loss, the most valuable commercial lesson an empire could learn, that the profit was in the trade, and the trade did not require the crown. The loss of America was a genuine blow to British pride, to British prestige, to the self-image of a nation that had believed itself invincible. None of that is denied. But the economic catastrophe everyone expected simply never arrived. The wealth stayed, the wealth grew, only the weight fell away. And a blow that costs you your pride while sparing your purse is a very different kind of blow from the one the world assumed Britain had suffered. Which brings us to the question that powers everything that follows. If the trade survived without the colonies, then where did the empire go? It did not stand still and lick its wounds. It turned, decisively, hungrily, toward the other side of the world, toward a place that would be ruled by the precise opposite of everything the American colonies had stood for. The wealth of America stayed in British ships, but the ambition of empire sailed east, and what it found there would build the largest dominion in human history. When a nation loses the center of its world, the natural assumption is that it will turn inward, that it will retreat, lick its wounds, and shrink to fit its reduced circumstances. Britain did the opposite. In the very decades when it was surrendering America, it was expanding with extraordinary energy in an entirely different direction. The question is not whether the empire survived the loss, it is where the empire went once the loss had been absorbed, and the answer points away from the Atlantic altogether, eastward, toward the vast and ancient subcontinent of India. This eastward turn matters enormously, because India was not simply a replacement for America, it was its opposite. Everything that had made the 13 colonies ungovernable, the settlers who carried their liberties with them, the assemblies that claimed the right to consent, the deep conviction that a free Englishman could not be ruled without his agreement, none of it applied in India. There were no transplanted Englishmen there demanding the rights of Englishmen. There was a foreign population, immense beyond imagining, to be administered and taxed by a handful of outsiders. The model was built on different ground entirely. And the instrument of this turn was not the British state at all. It was a company. The East India Company had begun, more than a century and a half earlier, as an association of London merchants chasing the spice trade, a private business, chartered to make money, answerable to its shareholders. For most of its long life it had been exactly that, a trading firm with warehouses and clerks, dealing in textiles and saltpeter, seeking profit in distant ports. It was not an arm of government, it was not built to rule, it was built to sell. How a trading company came to command armies and conquer kingdoms is one of the strangest stories in the history of empire, and it is essential to grasp. The company did not set out to govern India, it set out to trade in India. But it operated in a land where the old order was crumbling, where the great Mughal empire that had once ruled the subcontinent was fracturing into rival powers, and into that vacuum, a corporation with ships, money and soldiers found that it could do far more than trade. It could decide who ruled. The decisive moment came in 1757 on a mango field beside a river in Bengal, at a place called Plassey. It was less a battle than a conspiracy dressed in cannon smoke. The company's commander, Robert Clive, led perhaps 3,000 men against the Nawab of Bengal, whose army numbered around 50,000. By any honest reckoning, Clive should have been annihilated. Instead, he had secretly bought the loyalty of the Nawab's own commander, Mir Jafar, who held his troops back at the crucial hour. By sunset, the Nawab was in flight, and a corporation held the richest province of India. Think carefully about what that means. The conquest of Bengal, one of the wealthiest regions on earth, home to tens of millions of people, was not won by a king's army or decreed by a parliament. It was engineered by a company, through bribery and betrayal, to secure commercial advantage. This was conquest by balance sheet. The men who overthrew the Nawab were not soldiers of the crown pursuing national glory. They were servants of a corporation pursuing profit, and they had discovered that the surest profit of all came from controlling the government that taxed the trade. What followed was a slow, deliberate blurring of the line between trade and rule, until the line vanished altogether. Having made a puppet of the Nawab, the company found it could make and unmake rulers at will, each new puppet more dependent than the last, each transition squeezing more wealth from the province. The company kept the forms of Indian government. A Nawab still sat on his cushion, still held his court, but the power behind him was now a board of directors in London. It was a hollow sovereignty, a shell of the old order with a corporation living inside it. Then, in 1765, came the document that turned influence into law. After a second and harder victory at Buxar the year before, the company forced the Mughal emperor himself, Shah Alam II, to grant it the Diwani, the right to collect the land revenue and customs of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This was the turning point. The company was no longer merely the power behind a throne. It now held, in writing, from the emperor's own hand, the legal authority to tax tens of millions of people. A trading firm had been granted the revenues of an empire. Grasp the full strangeness of this. A private corporation, founded to buy pepper and cloth, now possessed the taxing power over one of the most populous and productive regions on the planet. And it used that power exactly as a corporation would, to maximize return. Indian tax revenues were now used to purchase Indian goods, which were then shipped to Britain and sold at a profit. The company no longer had to bring silver from home to pay for its trade. It simply taxed the Indians and bought their own goods with their own money. The wealth flowed one way, out. To do all this, the company built something no trading firm had ever needed: a vast apparatus of administration and a formidable army. It raised and trained an enormous force, the overwhelming bulk of it composed of Indian soldiers, the sepoys, led by British officers. It appointed collectors, magistrates, clerks. A corporation had grown a government inside itself: courts, tax offices, regiments, all the machinery of a state, owned by shareholders and run for dividends. The merchant had become the sovereign without ever ceasing to be a merchant. And here is the feature that makes India the answer to America. Over this immense population, tens of millions, soon hundreds of millions, there ruled only a tiny sliver of British administrators and officers, a few thousand outsiders governing a subcontinent. It was a structure of breathtaking imbalance, and it worked precisely because it offered the governed nothing. There were no assemblies, there was no representation, there was no pretense that the Indians under company rule held any rights an Englishman was bound to respect. Rule rested not on consent, but on revenue and force. Now set this directly beside the 13 colonies, because the contrast is the entire point. In America, Britain had ruled people who believed they were full Englishmen, entitled to representation, certain of their rights. And that belief had torn the colonies loose. In India, Britain ruled people to whom it offered no such belief in the first place. The American model had a fatal vulnerability. It granted rights that could later be demanded in full. The Indian model had no such weakness, because it began by granting nothing at all. This is the heart of why the eastward turn mattered so much. You cannot lose representation you have never granted. The colonists rebelled because they had tasted self-government and would not give it up. The Indians under company rule had no self-government to defend, no assemblies to rally, no constitutional claim the company recognized. The very thing that made the colonies ungovernable was simply absent. Britain had stumbled from a model that contained the seeds of its own rebellion into a model that contained none. Extraction asks nothing of consent. So the organizing principle of the empire quietly inverted. The American colonies had been, at bottom, about settlement. Englishmen building a new society and expecting to govern it. India was about extraction, a foreign apparatus drawing wealth from a population it would never absorb and never represent. These are two utterly different ideas of what an empire is for, and Britain shifted from the first to the second not through any grand design, but because the first had failed and the second was where the company already stood, ready and waiting. The road from a chartered company to the rule of a king's government would take decades more to travel, but its direction was set. The company that conquered Bengal would in time conquer almost the whole subcontinent, state by state, war by war, treaty by treaty. Mysore, the Marathas, the Sikhs, all falling in their turn. And as it grew, the question of who should truly control this dominion, a corporation or the crown, would force the British state to act. But the model itself, the extractive model, was now the engine of empire. That extractive model was immune to the disease that had killed the American colonies. But immunity is not the same as innocence, and honesty requires us to look at what the model cost the people who lived under it. The same logic that made India ungovernable-proof also made it ruthless. A corporation taxing a population for the benefit of distant shareholders has no reason to temper its extraction with mercy, and within a few years of gaining the Diwani, that ruthlessness produced a catastrophe whose scale is difficult even to comprehend. In 1770, Bengal was struck by famine. The harvests failed, but famine is rarely only a failure of rain. The company, having seized the revenues, had raised the land taxes sharply and went on demanding them, even as the crops withered and the people were left destitute. It continued to collect. It is estimated that the famine claimed something on the order of a third of the population of Bengal, many millions of lives, in a region the company governed for profit. The wealth had flowed out. The dying happened where the wealth had been. The model which replaced the American colonies was durable because it could not be lost the way America was lost. But durability bought at this price is its own kind of indictment. The thing that made the Indian model rebellion-proof, that it offered the governed no rights, no voice, no claim, was the very thing that made it capable of letting a third of Bengal perish while the revenue carts kept rolling. So sit, for a moment, with a single human figure beneath all this abstraction, a clerk in a company office in Bengal, ledger open, entering the day's revenue in neat columns while, beyond the walls, a province is hollowed out. He is not a monster. He is an employee, doing his job, recording numbers for shareholders an ocean away. And that is precisely the horror of the extractive model. It does not require monsters, it requires only clerks, and a system that has decided, in its very design, that the people on the other side of the ledger do not count. Lift back up to the scale of empire, and the meaning of the eastward turn comes clear. This expansion was not a consolation prize for the loss of America. It was vastly larger than anything Britain had surrendered. The 13 colonies had held some 2.5 million people. India held tens of millions, and would soon hold hundreds of millions. A population, a landmass, a source of wealth that dwarfed the Atlantic colonies entirely. Britain had let go of a province and laid hold of a subcontinent. And the timing is the quiet thunderclap at the center of this chapter. The company secured the Diwani, its legal grip on the revenues of Bengal, in 1765, a decade before the American Revolution even began. The machinery of the Eastward Empire was already turning, while the Western Empire was still intact. So, when America was lost in 1783, Britain did not have to invent a new direction. The new direction already existed, already vast, already growing. The loss did not force a frantic search for a replacement. It cleared the way for an empire that was already on the rise. This is what it means to say the defeat was the hinge. America had been the center of gravity, the great preoccupation, the most populous and developed possession. With it gone, the full weight of British ambition, capital, and attention could swing eastward to the place where the future of the empire actually lay. The colonies had been the past, a model that was failing. India was the future, a model that would carry the empire to the largest extent any power had ever reached. The loss removed the past and freed the future to grow. There was no master plan, no wise redirection, no architect of the eastward turn. What there was instead was chaos, private companies acting ahead of the government, adventurers conquering for profit, a state stumbling along behind, ratifying conquests it had never ordered and often tried to prevent. The empire that rose from the ashes of America was not designed. It was an accident, and to that accident, and the men who blundered into it, we turn next. Everything described so far, the loss of America, the turn to India, the shift from a failing settler model to a durable extractive one, has the shape of strategy. It sounds as though Britain looked at its defeat, drew the right lesson, and cleverly redirected its empire toward firmer ground. And if that is what happened, then this video is just another tale of imperial cunning. So, was it strategy? Did Britain plan this? The answer is no, and I want to be completely direct about it, because the temptation is to dodge. There was no master plan, no statesman in London surveyed the wreckage of 1783 and announced a grand new direction. No committee chose extraction over settlement. No architect designed the eastward turn. The men running Britain mostly did not understand what was happening to their own empire, even as it happened. The thing that replaced America was not the product of foresight, it was the product of chaos. Here is why "we did not mean to" is not an excuse but the actual point. The claim of this video has never been that Britain was wise. The claim is that the loss of America had a consequence. It removed the model that could rebel and left standing the model that could not, and that consequence held whether or not anyone intended it. A man who stumbles and falls out of the path of a falling rock is not clever, but he is alive. Britain did not steer toward the better empire. It tripped, and the better empire happened to be where it landed. And we do not have to guess at this, because the British themselves admitted it. Generations later, at the very height of imperial confidence, one of the empire's most eloquent defenders, the Cambridge historian John Seeley, looked back on how Britain had acquired its dominion and reached a startling confession. The English, he wrote, seemed to have conquered half the world in a fit of absence of mind, a champion of empire, describing the building of that empire as a kind of sleepwalk. The accident was not invented by the empire's critics, it was conceded by its admirers. Seeley went further still, and on India specifically, he was blunter than any modern skeptic would dare to be. The conquest of India, he wrote, was made blindly. Nothing great ever done by Englishmen was done so unintentionally, so accidentally. Sit with that. The single largest acquisition in the history of the empire, the jewel that would define British power for 2 centuries, described by a loyal imperial historian as the most accidental thing his countrymen ever did. Nobody planned it. To see the accident at work, look first at the western frontier, where Britain's own government tried to stop the expansion and could not. In 1763, fresh from victory over France, the Crown issued a royal proclamation, drawing a line down the crest of the Appalachian Mountains and forbidding the colonists to settle beyond it. This was not a push westward, it was a barrier against one. London wanted its colonists kept near the coast, where they could be governed and taxed, not scattered across a vast interior where no authority could reach them. And the colonists ignored it completely. The line was violated almost the moment it was drawn. Settlers poured over the mountains in defiance of the Crown's explicit command, and there was little the distant government could do to stop them. Here, at the very start, is the pattern that would define the whole empire. Expansion driven not by London's design but against it, by ordinary people and ambitious speculators reaching for land the government had tried to place off limits. The men in Westminster, were not directing the empire's growth. They were running behind it, failing to hold it back. The land speculators sharpened the picture. Behind the settlers crossing the Appalachians stood private companies, ventures in which colonial elites had sunk their fortunes, betting on Western land. These were not instruments of imperial policy. They were businesses, pursuing private profit, and when the Crown's line threatened their investments, they pushed against the Crown. The expansion of British settlement was being driven by speculation, by men chasing returns, with the government cast in the role of the obstacle they schemed to get around. Empire as a side effect of private greed. Now carry that same pattern east, because India is the supreme example of it. We have already seen that the conquest of Bengal was the work of a company, a private corporation pursuing commercial advantage, not a crown pursuing national glory. Clive's victory at Plassey was a business decision executed by a business to secure the revenues that fed the trade. The British state did not order the conquest of Bengal. It did not plan it, fund it, or at first even fully control the men who carried it out. A corporation had begun building an empire on its own account. When the company's conquests grew too vast and too scandalous to ignore, the British government's response was not to direct them, but to try to rein them in. Parliament grew alarmed at this corporation that had swallowed a subcontinent, at its corruption, its private armies, its servants returning home with obscene fortunes. The state's instinct was not, "Let us guide this expansion." It was, "Let us get this expansion under control." London was reacting to the empire, not commanding it. So Parliament legislated, twice, to bring the runaway company to heel. The Regulating Act of 1773 was a first attempt to impose government oversight on the corporation's affairs in India. And then in 1784, the year after America was lost, came Pitt's India Act, which created a board of control answerable to Parliament, set above the company to supervise its political conduct. Read those acts for what they are. They are not the blueprints of a confident imperial designer. They are the anxious efforts of a government scrambling to manage a conquest it had never authorized and could barely understand. Think about the timing of that second act once more, because it captures the whole strange truth. In the very year after Britain lost its Western Empire, Parliament was preoccupied not with planning a new one, but with trying to restrain the Eastern Empire a corporation had built without asking. The state was not pivoting, it was firefighting. The grand redirection that a tidy history would describe, from America to India, from settlement to extraction, was, on the ground, a government lurching from one unplanned conquest to the next, ratifying what it could not prevent. And this is the recurring shape of the thing across the whole map and the whole era. Private men, acting ahead of the state, presenting London with conquests already accomplished. Clive in Bengal. Speculators across the Appalachians. Later, men like Cecil Rhodes in Africa, carving out territory in the empire's name but on their own initiative. Again and again the pattern repeats. The adventurer moves first, seizes the ground, and only afterward does the government decide whether to claim what its subject has taken. The empire grew from the edges inward, not from the centre outward. So the state became, over and over, the reluctant inheritor of conquests it had not chosen. A company takes Bengal, the government, years later, moves to govern it. Settlers take the frontier, the government, belatedly, tries to administer it. An adventurer plants a flag, the government, faced with the fact, ratifies it rather than disown it. This is not how a designed empire behaves, it is how an accidental one accumulates, by 1,000 private initiatives that the centre absorbs after they have already happened, because disowning them seems worse than keeping them. The word for this is accretion, not decree. An empire built by decree would show a plan, a guiding intelligence choosing where to expand and why. The British Empire shows almost the opposite, a vast pile of territories acquired piecemeal by different men for different reasons across different decades, with no single mind directing the whole. It grew the way a coral reef grows, by countless small accumulations, not the way a building rises from an architect's drawing. And a thing that grows by accretion is, almost by definition, a thing that nobody planned, which means it was chaos, and not strategy, that drew the map. The expansion of British power across the globe was not the unfolding of a design, but the sum of innumerable uncoordinated grabs, by companies, by settlers, by soldiers and speculators acting on their own account. London did not conduct this. London struggled to keep up with it, legislating after the fact, governing what it had not sought, restraining what it could not stop. The largest empire in human history was assembled, to a remarkable degree, by men its own government was forever trying to control. Now bring this all the way back to America. The loss of the colonies did not teach Britain a lesson that it then wisely applied. There was no moment of insight, no learned redirection, no clever pivot. The men who lost America did not understand that they were being freed from a failing model. They experienced the loss as pure catastrophe, mourned it as defeat, and stumbled onward into the next conquest without grasping what the defeat had actually done for them. What the loss did, it did mechanically, without anyone's intention. It removed from the empire the one model that carried the seed of rebellion, the settler colony of free Englishmen who would demand their rights. And it left standing the model that carried no such seed, the extractive dominion over populations granted no rights to demand. Britain did not choose to keep the rebellion-proof model. The rebellion-prone model was simply taken away from it by the Americans themselves, leaving the durable one behind by subtraction. Loss did the work that strategy never performed. So the difference between this video's claim and the comfortable story is the difference between luck and wisdom. The comfortable story says Britain was clever, it learned, it pivoted, it built better. The truth is colder and stranger. Britain was lucky. It blundered into a defeat that happened to strip away its weakest possession and free its strongest direction to grow. There is no genius in this account. There is only a nation tripping forward through a chaos of private conquests and a single catastrophic loss that turned out, by no design, to be the best thing that could have happened to it. This is the difference between a pivot and a stumble. A pivot is deliberate, a turn chosen and executed. A stumble is involuntary, a lurch that happens to end somewhere useful. Britain did not pivot from America to India. It stumbled out of one and, quite separately, was already stumbling into the other, and only the neatening hand of hindsight makes the two stumbles look like a single graceful turn. Remove the hindsight, and what remains is not a plan. It is an accident, with a remarkably fortunate outcome. And notice how this reframing survives the hostile reading, which is precisely why it is built this way. A critic cannot dismiss this as imperial flattery, as a story that credits Britain with foresight it never had. It grants the skeptic everything: no plan, no wisdom, no design, only luck and chaos, and a government chasing conquests it could not control. The claim does not glorify the empire. It strips the glory out and leaves only the cold mechanics of subtraction. That is what makes it hard to knock down. So hold the line firmly on the one thing we can assert with confidence: the how. The empire that rose after America was not designed. It accreted, blindly, from private conquest and government scramble, exactly as its own defenders admitted. On this the evidence is overwhelming, and the verdict is firm. There was no architect, there was no plan. The thing built itself out of 1,000 uncoordinated grabs, and the loss of America fitted into that chaos, not as a strategic turning point chosen by anyone, but as a subtraction that no one intended and few even understood. And withhold judgment just as firmly on the thing we cannot settle, the worth. Whether this accidental empire was a triumph or a tragedy, whether the durable model that replaced America was a marvel of adaptation or merely a machine for ruling people who could not refuse, that question this video will not answer for you. We can be certain it was unplanned. We cannot and will not tell you it was good. The confidence belongs to the mechanism. The verdict belongs to you, which leaves the accident itself as the most interesting fact in the whole story. More interesting, in the end, than any tale of cunning could be. A small island lost its richest possession, blundered through a chaos of private conquests it could not direct, and emerged, without meaning to, as the largest power the world had ever seen. There is one lesson Britain did eventually draw from the trauma of 1776, a single, slow, hard-won lesson that took half a century to land. And to that one deliberate act, in an empire built by accident, we turn next. We have argued that the empire which rose after America was built by accident, not design. But there is one exception, a single, genuine lesson that Britain did eventually draw from the trauma of 1776. It is the one deliberate thread running through an otherwise unplanned story, and it is worth examining closely precisely because it is so rare. For once, Britain looked at what had gone wrong in America and resolved, consciously, never to let it happen again. The lesson was real. What is striking is how agonizingly long it took to learn. The lesson itself can be stated in a sentence. Never let a settler colony reach the point of rebellion. The 13 colonies had broken away because the demand for self-government, denied and resisted, had finally exploded into war. The remedy was not to deny self-government more firmly. It was to grant it, early, deliberately, before the demand could harden into revolt. Give the settlers control over their own affairs while they still felt loyal, and you would never again face an army of aggrieved colonists who had run out of patience with rule from across the sea. This was the heart of it. Release first, on your own terms, rather than be forced to release later, on theirs. The genius of the idea, if a thing built from such painful failure can be called genius, was its timing. The American colonists had been pushed to the point where only complete independence would satisfy them. But a colony handed self-government before it reached that point would have no grievance to rebel over. It would govern itself within the empire, contentedly, because the very thing rebellion sought had already been freely given. But here is the strange and revealing part. The lesson took roughly half a century to land. America was lost in 1783. The principle that would prevent a second America did not take real shape until the late 1830s. 50 years and more after the original wound. This is not the behavior of an empire that learned quickly and acted wisely. It is the behavior of an empire that stumbled toward the right answer slowly, painfully, and only after fresh trouble forced its hand. Even Britain's one deliberate lesson was half a century late, and the place it was finally learned was Canada, the very ground that had absorbed the human wreckage of the American defeat. When the 13 colonies broke away, those who had stayed loyal to the crown fled north in their thousands. These loyalists carried with them a sharp awareness of what had just happened, a determination to secure their rights as Englishmen, and a clear wish to set themselves apart from the new republic to the south. Canada was, from the start, the place where the American question would have to be answered again. For decades, the answer was fumbled. Britain governed its Canadian provinces through appointed officials and powerless assemblies, almost exactly the arrangement that had enraged the Americans. Elected representatives could debate but could not truly govern. Real power sat with a small, unaccountable elite answerable to London, not to the people. It was the old model, the failed model, transplanted north and left to fester, and it festered in precisely the way the American colonies had, building the same resentments toward the same kind of distant, unresponsive authority. In 1837 and 38, the inevitable happened, rebellion. Uprisings broke out in both Upper and Lower Canada, in the English-speaking province and the French-speaking one alike, as the frustrated demand for accountable government finally boiled over. The rebellions themselves were not large and they were put down, but to a British government with the memory of America still raw, the meaning was unmistakable and alarming. Here it was again, the same dynamic, the same grievance, the same drift toward revolt. The American disease had appeared a second time, and on the same continent. This time, Britain responded with something other than force. It sent a senior statesman, Lord Durham, to investigate the causes of the unrest and to recommend a remedy. And the report he produced, laid before Parliament in 1839, became one of the most consequential documents in the history of the empire. For Durham did not recommend tighter control. He recommended the opposite. He recommended that Britain do, deliberately and in advance, the very thing it had refused to do for the Americans: hand the colonists genuine control over their own internal affairs. The principle Durham named was responsible government, the idea that the executive governing a colony should answer to the colony's own elected assembly, not solely to officials appointed in London. Let the Canadians choose, in effect, their own ministers. Let local matters be settled locally by representatives the people had elected. Britain would retain the great questions: foreign policy, defence, trade. But the day-to-day governance of the colony would pass into the colony's own hands. It was self-government granted from above before it had to be seized from below. This was the American lesson, finally understood and deliberately applied. Everything that the 13 colonies had demanded and been refused, Durham proposed to give the Canadians freely. The logic was explicit in its purpose. A colony that governs itself has nothing to rebel against. Grant the substance of self-rule while loyalty remains intact, and you sever the very root of revolution. The report did not come into force overnight. Like everything in this story, it took years, roughly another decade, to be fully realized. But the principle was set, and it would reshape the empire. And once proven in Canada, the model spread to the other colonies of settlement. Through the 1850s, the same grant of responsible self-government was extended to the Australian colonies, to New Zealand, and to the British territories in southern Africa. Wherever Britain had planted settlers who might one day turn into Americans, it now applied the Canadian remedy: give them self-rule early, keep them loyal, and avoid the rupture. A single document, born of a single rebellion, became the template for governing the entire settler empire. The deeper aim was to keep the colony in the family, independent in its domestic life, yet bound to Britain by ties of loyalty, trade, language, and shared institutions. This was a wholly different vision of empire from the one that had lost America. Instead of holding settler colonies by force and resentment, Britain would hold them by consent and affection, loosening the grip precisely in order to keep the grasp. The colonies would grow steadily more self-governing over the decades, evolving toward full nationhood, but evolving within the imperial connection, not in revolt against it. And the results vindicated the approach. The colonies released early left peacefully. Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Each moved by slow, negotiated steps toward complete independence, gaining control over their foreign affairs, signing their own treaties, eventually being recognized as fully equal nations within the empire. There was no second Yorktown, no second Declaration of Independence, no war. The settler colonies that might have become a string of rebellious Americas instead became willing partners, achieving their freedom by evolution rather than by revolution. Now set against that, the colonies Britain ruled the other way, by extraction, without consent, granting no rights to demand. There the story ran utterly differently. The territories held by the extractive model could not be released early and kept loyal, because they had never been offered loyalty's foundation in the first place. They had to be held by force for as long as they were held at all, and when they finally went, they did not go gently. The contrast between the two models is the contrast between a peaceful parting and a violent rupture. India is the great example, and it makes the point with painful clarity. The subcontinent that Britain ruled by extraction was not granted responsible self-government in the 1850s. It was held by administration, by army, by force. And when independence finally came in the 20th century, it came not as a smooth evolution, but amid upheaval and bloodshed. The subcontinent torn apart in a partition that cost enormous numbers of lives and displaced millions more. The model that asked for no consent could offer no gentle exit. It had to be held hard, and so it broke hard. This is the deep irony that the two models reveal when placed side by side. The colonies Britain treated most like equals, granting them self-government, trusting them with their own affairs, were the ones it kept as friends. The territories it ruled most harshly, extracting wealth and granting nothing, were the ones whose departure was most violent. Generosity, applied early, produced loyalty and a peaceful parting. Extraction, maintained to the end, produced resentment and a bitter, bloody one. The empire reaped, in the manner of each exit, exactly what it had sown in the manner of each rule. Both outcomes, in the end, trace back to 1776. The peaceful evolution of the dominions was Britain applying the American lesson: release early, keep loyal. The violent rupture of the extractive territories was Britain never having needed that lesson there, because those populations had been given nothing to rebel over until the very moment they rebelled to take everything. One model was shaped by the memory of America. The other was the model America had been the exception to. The shadow of the lost colonies falls across both. And the proof that the Dominion model worked is that, generations later, those self-governing colonies remained Britain's closest partners rather than its rivals. The white settler dominions, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, drifted into full independence and yet stayed bound to Britain by the deepest ties. Ties that had survived precisely because Britain had loosened its grip in time. The empire had discovered how to let go of a settler colony without losing it. It had learned, at last, the thing America had tried to teach it. You can see the legacy of that bond still operating in the modern world. The intelligence partnership that links Britain, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the closest such alliance among nations anywhere, is, in its membership, very nearly a map of the old settler empire reunited, with the lost first colony rejoined to the dominions that learned from its loss. The institutions are new, but the affinities beneath them are old, rooted in the shared language, law, and political culture that the settler model carried wherever it went. So this is Britain's one deliberate lesson, and the exception that proves the larger rule. An empire built overwhelmingly by accident managed, in this single instance, to act with genuine foresight, to look at the catastrophe of America and resolve never to repeat it. But even here, the foresight was half a century late, forced out by fresh rebellion, and applied only to the settler colonies that resembled America in the first place. Everywhere else, the old chaos and the old extraction rolled on. One lesson, learned slowly, in an empire that mostly never learned at all, and beneath all of it ran a deeper engine, the machinery of money and ships that made the whole thing possible. To that engine we turn next. We have followed the story across the surface, the loss of America, the turn to India, the chaos of accidental conquest, the one deliberate lesson. But beneath all of it, driving everything, ran a hidden engine. The expansion of the British Empire was not, at bottom, a story of better soldiers or braver explorers. It was a story of money, of a single financial mechanism that let a small island outspend, outfight, and outlast every rival on Earth. To understand how the empire grew so large, you have to look beneath the conquests, to the machine that paid for them. The heart of that machine was a strange and powerful fact. Britain could borrow money far more cheaply than any of its rivals. Across the 18th century, the British government could fund itself at an interest rate of around 3%. This sounds like a dry technicality. It was, in truth, the most decisive advantage in the contest for global power. Cheap credit was a weapon that fired fleets and armies into the field on a scale that would have shattered the finances of any nation that tried to match it the ordinary way. To see why this mattered, look at France, Britain's great rival, and a far larger, more populous country. France could not borrow nearly so cheaply. Where Britain paid 3%, French kings had at times paid 10, 15% or more, and even then could not reliably raise the sums they needed. The reason was credibility. France was an absolute monarchy, and lending to an absolute monarch was dangerous, for a king could simply refuse to repay, default on his debts, and ruin his creditors with no recourse. Investors knew this, and they demanded a steep premium for the risk. And here is where the deepest irony of all reveals itself. Britain could borrow cheaply because of the very thing that had made the American colonies so troublesome: representation. In Britain, the people who lent the government money were represented in the parliament that controlled the government's taxes. They had a voice in the body that guaranteed their repayment. So they trusted the debt, and trust made the borrowing cheap. Consent, the thing the colonists demanded, was also the secret of British power. This was the secret advantage: consent to taxation. Because Parliament, representing the propertied men who held the nation's wealth, controlled the purse, and because Parliament had bound itself to honour the national debt, lenders believed they would be repaid. The rich agreed to be taxed through a parliament they sat in to service a debt they themselves largely owned. It was a closed and self-reinforcing circle of trust. The government could borrow vast sums because the men with the money governed the men who borrowed it. They were, in the end, the same men. That cheap, deep credit paid for the instrument that held the empire together: the Royal Navy. A navy is staggeringly expensive. Fleets of warships cost fortunes to build, arm, crew, and maintain. And across the 18th century, military spending consumed the great majority of the British budget, often 2/3 of it or more. No nation could fund such a force out of ordinary taxation alone. It had to be borrowed against the future. And because Britain could borrow more cheaply than anyone, Britain could afford a navy larger and more powerful than anyone. Credit became command of the sea. And the navy, in turn, protected the trade. British warships kept the sea lanes open, guarded the merchant fleets, secured the ports, and drove off rivals. Under the navy's shield, British commerce could reach every corner of the globe in relative safety, carrying goods to and from the markets that made the nation rich. The fleet that credit had bought made possible the trade that filled British coffers. The military power and the commercial power were not separate things. The one existed to protect the other, and the trade, in its turn, generated the wealth and the confidence that fed the credit. A nation visibly growing rich through global commerce was a nation lenders trusted to repay. The flourishing trade swelled the tax revenues, deepened the markets, and reassured the men who bought the government's debt that their money was safe. So the trade strengthened the credit that funded the navy that protected the trade. Each part fed the next. The circle had closed, and it had begun to turn. This is the flywheel, and it is worth stating whole, because it is the engine beneath the entire empire. Cheap credit funds the navy. The navy protects the trade generates the wealth secures the credit, and round it goes again, each rotation larger than the last. More credit, a bigger navy, wider trade, greater wealth, cheaper credit still, a self-reinforcing machine, spinning faster with every turn, throwing off the resources to conquer and hold an ever larger share of the world. This was the true engine of empire, not glory, mechanics. Now, connect this engine to the loss of America, because the connection is the point of the chapter. The settler colonies had been a drag on this machine, a standing cost, a constant military and administrative expense, and finally a ruinous war that added enormously to the national debt. When America broke away, that particular weight fell off the flywheel. The most expensive and troublesome possession was gone, while the trade with it, as we have seen, survived and grew. The machine had been relieved of a burden without losing the wealth that burden produced. So losing America let the flywheel spin freer. Britain shed the cost of governing and defending the colonies while keeping the commerce that flowed across the Atlantic. The drag was removed, the wealth remained, and the engine, lightened, could throw its full force into the directions where it paid best, into the trade with the independent United States, into the vast extractive dominion taking shape in India, into the global commerce that the Navy protected and the credit funded. The loss did not slow the machine, it freed it to run. This is the cold logic beneath the claim, expressed in the language of the engine itself. America had been a heavy, rebellious, money-losing piece of the machine. Remove it, and you keep the part that generated wealth, the trade, while discarding the part that consumed it, the rule. The flywheel, unburdened, spun faster than before. Shedding the costly colony while keeping the cheap commerce was not a tragedy for the engine. It was a tuning. The machine ran better without the weight it had been dragging. And then a second force seized the flywheel and drove it to a speed no empire had ever reached: industrialization. As Britain became the first nation to industrialize, its capacity to produce goods, generate wealth, and project power multiplied beyond all precedent. The factories poured out manufactures for the global markets the Navy protected. The wealth they generated deepened the credit further still. The financial engine that had already made Britain formidable was now coupled to an industrial engine that made it overwhelming. Two flywheels, locked together, spinning as one. Beneath these vast abstractions of credit and commerce, remember, sat real human lives, and the engine's wealth was not conjured from nothing. It was drawn, in large part, from the labor and the lands of the people the empire ruled and traded with, the enslaved on the plantations, the weavers and peasants of Bengal, the workers in the mills. The flywheel that lifted Britain to global supremacy was turned, in no small measure, by the toil and the suffering of millions who saw little of the wealth it generated. The machine was magnificent in its mechanics and brutal in its fuel. By the early 19th century, the machine was running at full speed, and running fastest in the decades after the defeat that was supposed to have crippled it. The credit was cheap, the Navy supreme, the trade global, the factories roaring, and the empire expanding toward a size the world had never witnessed. Everything the loss of America was meant to have broken was instead accelerating. The engine had not merely survived the amputation of the colonies, it had been improved by it, lightened by it, freed by it to reach a velocity no rival could approach. But no machine runs forever, and the seeds of the engine's eventual failure were already present in its design, though they would not bear their bitter fruit for another century. The flywheel depended on cheap credit, and cheap credit depended on a wealth and a confidence that the 20th century's catastrophes would one day drain away. For now, though, the machine was at its height, throwing off the power to seize a quarter of the planet. And it is to that astonishing peak, the largest empire in the history of the world, that we turn next. We have traced the loss, the eastward turn, the accident, the lesson, the engine. The claim throughout has been that the defeat of 1783 was the hinge on which the empire rose to a size no power had ever reached. It is time to look directly at that size, to stand before the scale of what Britain became, and to measure it against the catastrophe that was supposed to have ended it. The numbers are difficult to hold in the mind. That is precisely the point. At its height, the British Empire covered roughly a quarter of all the land on the surface of the Earth. Not a quarter of a continent, a quarter of the planet, some 13.5 million square miles, spread across every inhabited landmass, an expanse so vast it approached the area of the moon. No empire in the history of the world had ever held so much. The Mongols at their peak, the Romans at theirs, every great dominion that had come before, all were smaller. A small, wet island off the coast of Europe had come to rule the largest share of the earth ever governed by a single power. And it was not only land. By the years just before the First World War, the empire ruled over something on the order of 400 million people, close to a quarter of every human being alive on the planet at that time. Pause on that. Of all the people in the world, roughly 1 in 4 lived under some form of British authority. A nation whose home population numbered only in the tens of millions, governed hundreds of millions across the globe. The imbalance between the ruler and the ruled was, quite simply, without precedent in human history. This was the empire on which, in the famous phrase, "the sun never set," and the phrase was literally true, the British possessions were so scattered across every longitude that, at any hour of any day, the sun was shining on some part of the empire. When it was midnight over London, it was midday over the Pacific dominions. When dusk fell on India, dawn was breaking over Canada. The territory was so global, so total in its reach, that darkness never covered all of it at once. There was always daylight, somewhere, falling on British ground. Now hold this scale directly against the defeat that was supposed to have broken Britain. In 1783, the empire had lost its most populous and developed possession and seemed, to those who lived through it, to be in decline. And yet the peak, the absolute summit of British power and extent, came not before that loss but after it, decades after. The territorial maximum was reached in the years around the First World War, well over a century past the surrender of America. The empire did not peak and then lose the colonies. It lost the colonies and then peaked. Much of that final, staggering expansion came in a single late burst, as Britain joined the other European powers in carving up the African continent. In the closing decades of the 19th century, at conferences like the one held in Berlin, the powers of Europe drew lines across a map of Africa, lines that took little account of the peoples who actually lived there, and claimed vast territories as their own. Britain seized an enormous share, stretching its dominion across the continent. By the early 20th century, almost the whole of Africa lay under European control, and Britain held more of it than anyone. And at the centre of the whole edifice sat India, the extractive dominion whose conquest we traced, now grown into the very heart of the empire. The subcontinent and its hundreds of millions of people were the great possession around which much of British strategy, wealth, and military power revolved. The accidental conquest begun by a trading company had become the jewel of the largest empire on earth. Everything the eastward turn had set in motion after the loss of America had culminated here, in dominion over a fifth of humanity from a single subcontinent. Ringing the extractive core were the willing dominions, the settler colonies that had learned to govern themselves. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the rest had become largely self-ruling nations, bound to Britain not by force but by loyalty, drifting toward full independence while remaining within the imperial family. They were the empire's contented periphery, the proof of the lesson learned from America, sending their soldiers and their goods to the common cause not because they were compelled, but because they still felt themselves part of something shared. Two models of empire, the extractive and the consensual, joined in a single vast structure. Binding it all together was the global machinery the engine had built. The sea lanes, the ports, the telegraph cables, the railways, the financial plumbing that ran through the City of London. Goods, money, people, and orders flowed across the empire along arteries that all, in the end, led back to Britain. The world had been wired into a single system with London at its centre, the first truly global network of trade and communication and finance, knit together by the navy that credit had funded and the commerce that navy protected. The flywheel had spun the whole planet into one connected web. The thesis was that losing America would prove to be the making of the empire, and the scale of what Britain became is the evidence. Larger than any empire in history, a quarter of the Earth's land, a quarter of its people, a century and more after the defeat that was supposed to have finished it. If the loss of the colonies had truly been the catastrophe it appeared, this is not what should have followed. What followed instead was the greatest accumulation of power and territory the world had ever seen. Bigger, richer, longer-lived than anything that came before, and reached, every measure of it, in the wake of the defeat. And the scale is what makes it impossible to wave away. Britain did not merely survive the loss of America. It went on, afterward, to build the largest empire in the history of the human race. The defeat and the summit are not separated in the story by chance. The defeat cleared the ground, the engine did the work, and the summit was the result. And yet, we must hold the wonder and the unease together, because both are true and neither cancels the other. The scale is genuinely astonishing. There is no honest way to describe it without a kind of awe at the sheer magnitude of the thing. But that same scale was built on conquest, on extraction, on lines drawn through other people's lands, on the rule of hundreds of millions who were never asked. The empire was an extraordinary achievement and an extraordinary imposition at the very same time, in the very same act. To see only the wonder or only the unease is to see half of it. which forces the question the scale itself cannot answer. The empire was undeniably vast, but was it good? It was larger than any before it, but better for whom? Better for Britain, certainly. The wealth and the power flowed home. But the people beneath the quarter of the earth that Britain ruled, the Indians taxed, the Africans whose lands were partitioned at a table in Berlin, the millions governed without their consent. For them, the question of whether this magnificent edifice was a triumph looks very different indeed. The scale answers how big. It does not answer whether it was worth it. And that is the question this video has promised, throughout, to leave with you rather than answer for you. We have shown, beyond reasonable dispute, that the loss of America was followed by the rise to a scale without precedent, that the defeat was, in the cold mechanical sense, the making of the empire. We have not told you, and will not tell you, whether that making was a glory or a crime, or both at once. The scale is the vindication of the claim about size. The verdict on its worth still waits. But first, the machine that built all this must finally break, and to its ending we now turn. Every engine that can be built can be broken, and the machine that built the British Empire was no exception. We come now to the ending, but this video will not give you the ending as a mood, a vague sense of decline, a sad fading of glory. The empire ended for reasons, and the reasons were mechanical. The same engine that had carried Britain to a quarter of the earth seized up in the 20th century, and once it seized, it could not be restarted. To understand the fall, you must understand it as the failure of the machine that powered the rise. The first great blow fell with the First World War. The engine, remember, ran on cheap credit, on Britain's unmatched ability to borrow at low cost against a wealth and a confidence the world trusted. War on the scale of 1914 to 1918 devoured that wealth at a staggering rate. The costs were beyond anything the old system had been built to bear. The conflict consumed lives and treasure on a scale that strained British finances to their limit and beyond. The machine had been designed for the wars of the 18th century. It now faced the wars of the 20th. And the debt that the war piled up was of a different order from anything the engine had absorbed before. The whole genius of the system had been that Britain could borrow vast sums cheaply and carry them comfortably, because the wealth flowing in always outpaced the cost of the debt. But the First World War loaded the nation with obligations so enormous that the old comfortable arithmetic began to break. Britain emerged victorious and exhausted, its finances strained, its position as the world's preeminent economic power already slipping toward the rising giant across the Atlantic. Meanwhile, the extractive model, the very thing that had made the post-America empire so durable, was breeding the force that would tear it apart. Recall the logic. The extractive territories were ruled without consent, granted no rights, offered no voice. That had made them rebellion-proof for a time. But a population ruled without rights does not remain quiet forever. It develops, in time, exactly the demand that the model had denied it. The demand for self-rule, for dignity, for the end of foreign domination. The model that asked for no consent was now generating, across the empire, the hunger for it. Nowhere was this clearer than in India, the jewel of the whole edifice. The extractive dominion that had been the heart of British power became the heart of the demand to end it. A vast nationalist movement arose, calling for the self-government that the extractive model had withheld for nearly 2 centuries. The very logic that had made India so valuable, rule over hundreds of millions who were granted nothing, guaranteed that, sooner or later, those hundreds of millions would demand everything. The richest possession was now the source of the loudest call for the empire's end. Then came the Second World War, and with it the final drain. If the First World War had strained the engine, the second shattered its financial foundation outright. Britain threw everything into the conflict, devoting an enormous share of its entire economy to total war, spending on a scale that no nation could sustain. By the middle of the war, Britain was, in effect, bankrupt, its reserves exhausted, its easily sold assets sold, its capacity to fund itself from its own resources simply gone. The engine had run out of fuel. The wealth that fed the credit was no longer there. So bankruptcy, not defeat in battle, was the true cause of the retreat. This is the crucial point, and it is the point the mechanical view makes clear. Britain emerged from the Second World War on the winning side, its territory intact, its armies victorious. And yet it could no longer afford its empire. It had survived the war only by borrowing enormously from the United States, and it came out of the conflict economically broken, dependent on American support, unable to fund the fleets and garrisons that holding a global empire required. The machine had not been conquered, it had simply run dry. And then, in 1956, a single episode exposed the new reality for all the world to see. When Britain, with France and Israel, moved militarily to seize control of the Suez Canal, it found that its power was now an illusion. The intervention collapsed, not because Britain lost the fighting, but because the United States, opposed to the venture, threatened the British currency, and Britain, financially dependent and vulnerable, was forced into a humiliating withdrawal. Military strength had proven worthless without financial sovereignty. The empire could still field a fleet. It could no longer afford to defy the power that now held its purse. Suez did not cause the decline. The engine was already failing before it, but it stripped away the last illusions. It revealed, in a single humiliating episode, what had already become true, that Britain was no longer a power that could act on the world stage by its own will, that it now moved only with the permission of the United States, the new giant that had inherited global preeminence. The flywheel was running down, and Suez was the moment everyone could see it. The machine still turned, but feebly, and at another's sufferance. What followed was decolonization, the flywheel winding to a stop. India led the way, gaining its independence in 1947, and the rest followed in a great cascade through the 1950s and 60s. Colony after colony, across Asia and Africa and the Caribbean, became independent, until the empire that had covered a quarter of the earth had largely dissolved within a single generation. The engine that had spent 2 centuries accumulating territory now released it, almost as fast, because it no longer had the wealth or the power to hold on. And here, at the very end, the 2 models of empire showed their true colours one final time, for the dominions left as designed, while the colonies left in anger. The settler dominions, granted self-government early and bound to Britain by consent, drifted peacefully into full independence, remaining partners and friends. The extractive territories, ruled without consent to the last, often departed amid upheaval and bitterness, and in the case of India, amid the bloodshed of partition. The manner of each exit mirrored exactly the manner of each rule. This is why the 2 exits looked so utterly different. The colonies released early and ruled with consent had nothing to rebel against, and so they parted as friends. The territories ruled by extraction had everything to resent, and so they parted in anger, sometimes in blood. Generosity, applied in time, was repaid with loyalty even at the moment of separation. Extraction, maintained to the end, was repaid with bitterness. The empire reaped, in its dissolution, precisely what it had sown in its rule. And the deepest lesson, the lesson of 1776, was confirmed by the manner of the ending. America had taught that a population ruled without consent will eventually rise and break free. The dominions had absorbed that lesson, and were released before they could rebel. The extractive empire had never applied it, and so, in the end, it faced everywhere the very thing America had foretold, the demand of the governed to govern themselves, pressed until the empire could hold on no longer. The whole arc, from the first lost colony to the last, was the working out of that single truth. Why could the machine not simply be restarted? Because the conditions that powered it were gone, and gone for good. The engine had run on cheap credit drawn from unmatched wealth and confidence. And the wealth was spent, the confidence transferred to the United States, the industrial supremacy long since lost to rising rivals. You cannot rebuild a flywheel whose every component has been carried off. The empire could not be revived because the machine that had built it no longer existed, and the world that had allowed it had passed away. So the thing that had grown for structural reasons ended for structural reasons, and the symmetry is the heart of the matter. The empire rose because a financial engine let a small island outborrow, outbuild, and outlast every rival, and because the loss of America freed that engine to run. It fell because the engine's fuel, the wealth, the credit, the supremacy, was consumed by the catastrophes of the 20th century, and because the extractive model bred the resistance that the consensual model had avoided. It was machinery on the way up, and it was machinery on the way down. The sun, in the end, did set on the largest empire the world had ever known, not all at once, but colony by colony, until the maps were redrawn and the great structure was gone. And so the mechanical story is complete. How a small island built the largest empire in history by accident and engine, and the fortunate loss of America, and how that same empire seized up and dissolved when the engine finally failed. Only one question now remains, the question this video has promised, from the very beginning, to leave in your hands. Was it triumph or was it tragedy? To that final reckoning we turn. We return, at the end, to the question we opened with. A small island lost its richest possession in 1783 and went on to build the largest empire the world has ever seen. We have traced how that happened. The failing settler model shed, the durable extractive model embraced, the chaos of accidental conquest, the one lesson learned late, the engine of money and ships, the peak, the fall. The mechanical story is finished. But the human question it raises is not, and it is the question this final chapter exists to place, deliberately and squarely, into your hands. Let us first state the case that the loss was the making, in its strongest form, because the evidence for it is real. Britain did lose America. Britain did then rise to a scale no power had ever reached. The defeat removed the rebellious, costly settler colonies and left standing the durable, extractive dominion. The trade survived, the engine ran freer, the empire grew larger, richer, and longer lived than anything before it. On the cold question of consequence, did the loss precede and enable the rise? The answer the evidence gives is yes. The catastrophe of 1783 was, mechanically, the hinge of the ascent. The events themselves say it plainly: bigger, richer, longer lived, and every measure of it reached after the defeat. This is not interpretation, it is chronology. The territorial peak came over a century past the loss. The wealth flowed in greater volume after than before. The empire that the surrender at Yorktown was supposed to have broken instead went on to its greatest extent. If you ask only whether losing America was followed by the making of the empire, the historical record returns a clear and almost startling verdict. And here is where this video hands you the knife, because the cold question of consequence is not the only question, and you have surely felt the other one pressing all along. To say the loss was the making of the empire is to say something only about Britain, about its power, its wealth, its extent. It says nothing about the people on the other side of that greatness. And the moment you turn to them, the whole verdict shifts beneath your feet, and what looked like a triumph begins to wear a very different face. For the empire was better, but better for Britain. That is the quiet qualifier that hangs over the entire achievement. The wealth flowed to London, the power accrued to the British state, the glory belonged to the nation that ruled. The benefits of the largest empire in history were not evenly shared among the quarter of humanity it governed. They ran, overwhelmingly, in one direction, homeward. When we say the loss of America made the empire greater, we must always finish the sentence, greater for whom? The answer is not the people the empire was made of. Recall what the better model actually was. The thing that replaced the rebellious American colonies, the durable rebellion-proof model that carried the empire to its peak, was rule by extraction over populations granted no rights, no voice, no consent. Its durability was precisely its denial. It could not be lost the way America was lost, because it offered nothing that could be demanded back. The very feature that made it the engine of imperial greatness was the feature that made it, for those who lived beneath it, a machinery of domination without recourse. And that model had a human cost it is dishonest to look away from. It was the model that let a third of Bengal perish in the famine of 1770, while the revenue carts kept rolling. It was the model under which, when slavery was finally abolished, the British government paid £20 million in compensation, an immense sum, near half the Treasury's spending that year, entirely to the slave owners for the loss of their human property, while the people who had been enslaved received not a single penny. The greatness and the cost were not separate. They were the same empire. This is the problem the empire had solved, stated boldly. It had found how to rule people who believed they had rights. By ruling, instead, people it had decided did not. The American colonists could not be held because they were granted the rights of Englishmen and demanded them in full. The solution the empire stumbled into was not to honor those rights more widely. It was to build its greatness on populations to whom such rights were never extended at all. The durability was bought by the denial. That is the engine, and that is the indictment, in a single breath. So the empire solved the problem of subjects who believe they have rights. By ruling people it never meant to have them. Sit with the full weight of that sentence, because it is the moral core of the whole story. The thing that made the post-America empire work was not a triumph of liberty extended. It was the opposite, a vast dominion deliberately built on the absence of the very liberties that had torn the first empire apart. The genius and the crime are inseparable. The one is the other, seen from a different side, which leaves the question genuinely, deliberately open, and this video will keep its promise not to close it for you. Was this a triumph of adaptation, a small nation's remarkable capacity to lose, learn, and rise to unprecedented heights? Or was it simply a conqueror that, having failed to hold a people who could say no, found instead a quarter of humanity who could not, and called the result greatness? Both readings fit the same facts. The triumph and the tragedy are not competing accounts of different events. They are two true descriptions of one. And the verdict belongs to you, not to this video, because it is a question of values and not of evidence, and on questions of value, you are the only proper judge of your own conclusion. We have shown you the mechanism beyond reasonable dispute: the loss, the turn, the accident, the engine, the rise, the fall. We have shown you the cost beyond reasonable dispute: the famines, the extraction, the rule without consent. What we have not done, and will not do, is tell you how to weigh the magnificence against the cost. That weighing is yours. That is the knife, and it is in your hand now.